Let's continue styling our form in this lecture. So once more, we add a new component here to a components folder. So form.scss, add .form in here, and of course also include it here. So form, save it and close it. All right. So we have the form, then in there we have the form input. And of course the form label, at least for now. And of course we also have the form group. And let's start with the input actually. Okay, so font size of 1.5, rem. Let's give it a nice padding of 1.5 in the top and bottom, and then 2 on left and right. And usually we always do it like this, like in buttons and form elements. We give it a bit more on the sides because that makes element look better actually. If we just give it 1.5, it looks a bit strange. It looks like it's smaller on the sides than it actually is. So always a bit more on the sides. Okay. Now a nice border radius as well. Let's do it only 2 pixels this time because the element itself is a lot smaller. And then we want it to have a background color where we can look through a bit. So we use RGBA again. White, and let's say 50% opacity. Also, we want to get rid of the border, so border none. All right, let's take a look at that before we do anything else. Okay, now the first thing that you notice is probably the font family. It's not the same as we have in the rest of our web page. So the font family is not Lato. And that's the default thing that the browsers do actually. So by default, they don't give it the font family that we have for a web page. So let's set it. And well, we could do font family and now set it to Lato, but we can do something better with something that we learned in one of the theoretical lectures. And we can say the font family directly to inherit. And that's it. And so now it will automatically inherit the font family as well. So you know that usually all elements, they automatically inherit the font family, but not the input elements. And so we set it manual here, and then you see it will work now. So slight difference, but it's clearly visible. Okay. Now let's just give some space here between these form groups. Okay. So we want a margin bottom, but we don't want it on the last one. So we use our old trick where we style everything except the last child. So margin bottom, let's say 2 rem, and that will improve things a bit. Okay, what you also saw here was that when we selected the element, then you saw this blue border here going on, right? And that's also something that we don't want to see. Now this blue border appears on the input elements when it's focused, okay? So this is the focus state. And in CSS, we can actually style it using the focus pseudo element. Okay, so let's do that. So instead of like active or hover or something like that, it's simply called focus. And that blue line that we see is called the outline. So we used outline before, like in the first section in the beginning where we have these 3 images, and then when we hover, we have this green border around them. That's also an outline, okay? But this one is an outline which the browser gives us by default. And we don't want that, so we set it to none. Now this focus is actually very important for people who use a web page without a mouse, but only with a keyboard. And so when they move around with a keyboard on a web page, they need to know which form elements are actually focused. And so for accessibility reasons, we should never just do input focus and then set the outline to none and call it a day. Okay, so we should always make the form elements that are focused visible. All right, so let's do that, and we will do it by giving it a box shadow. Okay, and also give it a border at the bottom. So box shadow, 0, 1 rem in the Y direction, 2 rem of blur, and then color black with 0.1. And then, as I said, a border at the bottom of 3 pixels. Then we say it should be solid, and then we say we want it to be our primary color. So the border is just a shorthand property for the border width, the border style, and the border color. But it's easier to just specify them all at once here. So let's take a look at that now. And all right, so now we have this nice shadow and the green line as well. Now what you see here is that when you click this, you will see that this one here moves down a bit. Okay, and that's because of the 3 pixels that are created here for the border here that's being added. Okay, and so what we should do is to actually add that, that border here in the initial state as well. Okay, but we set it to transparent. All right, and so it will be invisible in the normal state, and then as soon as we click it, as it's focused, it becomes green. Now another thing that I also want to do is to give it a width, so 100%, and we should, since we're at it, also display it as a block, okay? So that's better, so that it has its own line here. All right, well, maybe it's a bit too much here with the 100%, so let's just put it back to 90. But you see that now this effect that we had going on here, where this one then jumped up and down, is now gone, okay? So let's do that. And another thing that we can do is to actually style the placeholder here, okay? So that's also nice. You see it in here, it's this really light gray here. And so with that, we show that it's actually only a placeholder. And as soon as we start typing, you see that it becomes darker, okay? So let's do that. So 90% here. Let us use a brand new pseudo element, and that one is called WebKit input placeholder. Okay, so WebKit input placeholder. And this right now will only work on Safari and Chrome, okay? But hopefully it will get implemented in the other browsers as well. So remember that pseudo elements, they are with these 2 colons, and they represent things that are actually on the web page. And so a placeholder is, of course, a pseudo element and not just a pseudo class, which stands more for states, yeah, like focus, right? So let us style the color for this one here. And so I guess we now need a new variable because this is a new color that we don't have yet. So this is another dark gray, color dark, the gray or gray dark, and I'm going to call this one number 2. And so this one should really be number 1, but I don't want to change it now because then I have to go to the place where I used this here and change the variable name. So we should have actually thought about this right from the beginning, but well, that wasn't the case. So now we can't use that, okay? All right, and so let's use that color actually. Where, here it is. So we don't need the home anymore. I will actually call this variable name here. All right. Now, another thing that I wanted to show you, let's first check this one here. Well, this didn't really change. Well, let's check it out again. And yeah, of course, I see why it doesn't work. It's because this one is, of course, not on the form. You see, we are here on the form level. So right now we're saying form and then WebKit input placeholder. But of course, this is on the input, right? And so this should, of course, be in here. And since we're at that, this here is also not in the right place. I mean, it works, but we're not using the power of nesting here, right? So why I repeat the input, we should just do it like this, right? So now it should work. And yeah, here we go. So now it's this column, and when I start typing, it becomes dark. And actually it becomes pretty dark, it becomes black actually. And that's because once again, the font color is not really inherited. So we have to set this once again to inherit. So that's something really particular to these input elements. They don't inherit basically the font properties, okay? Now another very cool thing that we can do is to actually make use of the validation that Google Chrome has. So remember that I told you that here in the email input, for example, we specified the email type, and then Google Chrome will test if we're actually writing in a valid email address or not. And if we're not, it will basically be invalid. And in CSS, we can actually use that, because on an input element, we can use the invalid pseudo class. Okay, the invalid and of course also the valid pseudo class. And then we can apply specific styles to when the value is valid or when it's not valid. So let me show it to you actually. So in here, we start with this here yellow, and yellow, or let's say orange. Orange means that the input is not correct. So let me start writing something here. So hello is not really a valid email address. But now you saw as soon as I started writing here after the @ symbol, it turned green, right? The same thing here. So we said that it should be required, but right now there's no text, and so it's not valid. So right now if I would submit this form, then it will say, please fill out this form. But if I now start writing here, it becomes green. If I delete this one here, it gets orange again, and it says, please fill out this field. And if I just write something invalid, it says, please include an @ in the email. And so we can take advantage of that invalid states, okay? Now, one other thing, when do we actually want this to happen? Well, we want it to happen only when the field is actually focused, right? And so we set focus once again, and then invalid. And that's it. So when we have an invalid focused input element, then this is the style that we want to apply. So we want a border that is orange. And so let me get the color here. So it's called color secondary dark. Color secondary dark. Okay, and that should do the trick. And here it is. So right now it's invalid. And now I typed, and now it is valid. And then here, hello at jonas.io. And so now it's valid. Like this, it's not valid. And like this, it's also not valid. All right, so that works. So now, before we move on to the radio buttons, let's do that trick where we make this part here invisible and only appear as soon as we write something here in the input. And so basically it will then look like that name here, that text would fly out and come out here, down here, okay, because it's actually the same text. So this effect here, you see the full name and it moves down like that, okay? So nice little effect, but I think it makes all the difference to have these subtle things on a web page, okay? So let's now actually start by formatting here this label. So we give it a pretty small font size of 1.2 rem. Make it bold with 700 of font weight. And then we give it a margin left with 2 rem. That's because we want it positioned exactly on the same position which the text is on top. And then a margin to the top of 0.7 rem. Okay, and finally we should also display this as a block, because otherwise, you know, we cannot really use these box model properties here on the element, right? So let's take a look at that now. And yeah, so now you see this is now really aligned here so that the effect will actually work that we're looking for. And now we need to take care of the magic where this is only shown as soon as we have some text in here. And so once again, this is really only CSS and no JavaScript included. And what allows us to do this is to use the placeholder shown pseudo class, okay? And so the placeholder shown is again here on the input. Now I'm not going to really place it here, and I'm going to explain to you why in a second. But for now, trust me that this is how it has to be done. So input and then placeholder shown. So when the placeholder is shown on the input element, then we can now style it. But it's not the input that we want to style, right? What we want to style is the label, right? We want the label to be hidden and not the input. And so in here, we also have to select the label. So let me first do it like this. But probably you notice that this is not going to work. And why is that? Well, because the label is not a child element of the input, right? So we see in the HTML that they are siblings, so they're at the same level. They're both childs of the form group, okay? So again, input and label, they are siblings. Because they're on the same level, they're both children of this parent element. But in CSS, we have a very powerful selector, and that is called the sibling selector. And so this is how it works. And this one is actually the adjacent sibling. So what is an adjacent sibling? Well, it's just a sibling that comes immediately after the element that we select in the first place. So we first select input, and then with the adjacent sibling selector, we select the first sibling, which is the label. And so in this case, this works. But if there was some other elements in between here, let's say here was another div, and then there was like some button or something, okay, so this would totally be possible, then we could still use a sibling selector, but we would have to use this one, okay? So this is the general sibling selector. So this one works if there are more levels in between. But now we can use the adjacent sibling because the sibling is right next to the first element. Now, one particular thing about the sibling selector is that the sibling that we have to select, in this case the label, always has to be after the first element, so the input in this case. All right, so again, the label needs to be after the input, which is the case here, in order to be selected with the sibling selector. So just as we have it here. So we have the input and then we select the sibling of that element and a sibling called label. If the HTML was written the other way around, so if we had the label before the input, like this wouldn't work. There would be no way of selecting the label here from the input. Okay, and that's the reason why I wrote the HTML in this order. All right, so when you need to use the sibling selector, then you need to be careful about that. All right, so when the placeholder is shown, meaning that we have written nothing in our input, we want the label to be hidden, right? So opacity 0. And then another thing that we should do is to set the visibility to hidden. And that's because if we just set the opacity to 0, then the element will basically still be on the page, but only invisible. But if we set it to visibility hidden as well, then it's really gone, okay? So why don't we just use visibility hidden without the opacity? Well, because we cannot animate the visibility, okay? And so we use the opacity because we actually want to animate this effect, right? And actually, let me show it to you. So setting the transition here to all in 0.3 seconds, and then you will already start seeing the effect. So reload, and so now it's gone, okay? Meaning that right now the placeholder shown pseudo class is active, okay? And so right now this selector here is working. So the placeholder is shown. But as soon as we start writing, the placeholder is gone, and then these styles here will be gone as well. So that's what happens now. So you saw the opacity was animated, and so it faded in. And now it faded out, in, out, you see. Now what we want this to happen is to also move down from here, right? And so in initial state, it has to be there, transform, translate, and of course it's in the Y direction, and it's going up, and so -4 rem. Okay, let's actually show it to you how it will look like, still visible. So to justify why I used the -4 rem, okay, so this is where the input is. In this state, and when I start writing, it moves down, okay? So let's make it invisible again, give it a save. And now, here we go. So, really cool, right? In the next lecture, we will then take care of actually adding these radio buttons here. So stay tuned for that next lecture.